My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 32 years old, and most days I spend more time carrying lumber than holding conversations. I own a small contracting business just outside Portland. Nothing fancy. Mostly kitchen remodels, deck repairs, bathroom renovations. The kind of work where you spend your days fixing things other people didn't realize were falling apart until it was almost too late. I've always liked that. I like problems that make sense. A cracked beam. A leaking pipe. A crooked foundation. Those things have solutions. People don't. I learned that the hard way. And strangely enough, it started in a hospital room. Not with an emergency. Not with bad news. Not with some dramatic moment that felt like it belonged in a movie. It started with a joke. At least that's what I thought it was at the time. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and lavender lotion. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the large windows, painting warm golden squares across the floor. My grandmother, Margaret Carter, was propped up against a mountain of pillows, looking far healthier than someone who had spent the previous week worrying her entire family. At 82 years old, Margaret possessed a remarkable talent. She could make everyone around her nervous while somehow remaining completely relaxed herself. That afternoon was no different. The room was crowded. My cousin Rachel sat near the television scrolling through her phone. My uncle Frank stood by the door balancing a paper cup of coffee. A nurse drifted in and out checking monitors. And standing quietly near the window was Emily Brooks, Margaret's caregiver. Emily had been helping my grandmother for nearly 3 years. Long enough to become part of the family. Long enough that nobody thought twice about her being there. Especially me. At the time, she was just Emily. Reliable. Kind. Patient. The person who always seemed to know exactly what Margaret needed before anyone else did. The person who somehow remembered everybody's birthdays. The person who could calm my grandmother down during her stubborn moments better than any doctor ever could. Nothing more. At least that's what I told myself. Margaret glanced around the room. A mischievous smile slowly spread across her face. That smile should have warned me. It always meant trouble. Her eyes landed on me. "Oh, Daniel." I looked up from my phone. "What?" She tilted her head. "You know what your problem is." Several family members laughed immediately. Because Margaret always had opinions about everyone else's problems. I groaned. "This should be good." "It will be." She pointed a finger at me. "You're 32 years old." The room immediately grew interested. I already knew where this was going. "No." "Yes." "No." "Absolutely yes." A few people chuckled. Rachel looked up from her phone. "Oh, this is going to be fun." Margaret ignored all of us. She kept staring directly at me. Then she delivered her verdict. "You need a wife." The room exploded into laughter. Even I laughed. Mostly because this wasn't new. Margaret had been trying to marry me off since I turned 25. Every holiday. Every birthday. Every family gathering. According to her, every unmarried woman within a 50-mile radius was apparently a candidate. I shook my head. "Here we go again." "I'm serious." "You're always serious." "You should listen to me more often." "I've survived this long without taking relationship advice from you." "Oh, that's obvious." More laughter. Even the nurse smiled. Margaret looked extremely pleased with herself. The entire room felt light. Comfortable. Safe. Just another family conversation. Just another afternoon. Just another joke. And then something happened. Something so small that I almost missed it entirely. A quiet voice. Soft. Barely louder than a breath. Coming from somewhere near the window. Maybe I could be. For a second, I thought I imagined it. I turned instinctively. My eyes landed on Emily. She was standing exactly where she'd been before. One hand resting against the curtain. Sunlight outlining her profile. But the moment our eyes met, she lowered her gaze. Then she turned. Quickly. Almost too quickly. And walked toward the hallway. The door closed softly behind her. Nobody else reacted. Nobody else seemed to notice anything unusual. The conversation continued. Margaret was already arguing with my uncle about something else. The room carried on exactly as it had before. But I couldn't. Because for just a second, I was almost certain I'd heard something. 4 simple words. Words that made absolutely no sense. Words Emily would never say. Would she? I stared at the doorway, trying to replay the moment. Trying to convince myself I was mistaken. Because surely I had to be. Emily Brooks wasn't interested in me. That would have been ridiculous. Impossible. And yet, for the rest of the afternoon, I found myself looking toward that hallway more often than I should have. Wondering. Questioning. Replaying those words over and over again. Maybe I could be. Looking back, those 4 words were the first honest thing Emily had ever said to me. The problem was, I wasn't ready to hear them. For the rest of that afternoon, I told myself I had imagined it. Honestly, it wasn't a difficult lie to believe. People hear what they want to hear all the time. A voice in a crowded room. A song lyric from across a store. A conversation that wasn't actually about them. The brain fills in blanks. Creates meaning where there isn't any. At least that's what I told myself. Because the alternative made absolutely no sense. Emily Brooks was not secretly in love with me. The very idea was ridiculous. And if you had asked me then, I would have given you a list of reasons why. The biggest one being that Emily and I weren't that kind of close. At least not officially. The truth was more complicated. Because if you looked at our lives from the outside, most people would have assumed we were already together. They would have been wrong. But I could understand why they thought it. The problem was that Emily had slowly become part of my life the same way sunlight becomes part of a room. You don't notice it arriving. One day it's simply there. Everywhere. Constant. Comfortable. Necessary. And because it happens gradually, you stop noticing it altogether. That's exactly what happened with Emily. The following Monday started like most Mondays. Too early. Too cold. And far too dependent on coffee. I arrived at a remodeling project just after 7 in the morning. The homeowner wanted a complete kitchen renovation. New cabinets. New flooring. New countertops. The kind of project that looked simple until you opened a wall and discovered 3 decades of questionable decisions hiding behind drywall. I was unloading tools from my truck when my phone buzzed. A text message. Emily. Good luck with the cabinet installation today. Don't forget your coffee. I smiled. Mostly because she was late. The coffee was already in my hand. I texted back. A minute later my phone buzzed again. Check the passenger seat. Confused, I opened the truck door. There was another coffee sitting there. Exactly the way I ordered it. Medium roast. 1 cream. No sugar. I stared at it for a second. Then laughed. Somehow Emily always knew when I was running late. Somehow she always knew when I'd forget breakfast. Somehow she always seemed to notice things before anyone else did. I picked up the cup and shook my head. That was Emily. Thoughtful. Reliable. Predictable. The kind of person who remembered details most people overlooked. I didn't think anything of it. At least not then. Because remembering someone's coffee order doesn't mean anything. Right? The funny thing about hindsight is that it makes everything look obvious. At the time, it never feels that way. A few days later, I found myself standing in Emily's apartment building holding a toolbox. Again. Her kitchen sink had started leaking. Actually, that wasn't entirely true. The sink had started leaking 3 weeks earlier. Emily had simply waited until the problem became impossible to ignore before mentioning it. She opened the apartment door before I could knock. You're late. I looked at my watch. I'm 3 minutes early. Contractor math doesn't count. I laughed. You called me because your sink is leaking. I called because my sink is flooding. That sounds dramatic. Come look. The apartment itself was small. Comfortable. The kind of place that immediately felt lived in. Books on shelves. Plants near windows. Blankets folded neatly on furniture. A home. The sink took less than 20 minutes to fix. A worn-out seal. Nothing serious. I tightened a few connections and turned the water back on. The leak disappeared. Emily folded her arms. Show off. I literally do this for a living. Still showing off. I smiled. She smiled back. And for a moment the room felt strangely quiet. Comfortable. Easy. The kind of silence people don't usually notice. Then her phone rang. The moment vanished. Neither of us thought about it again. At least that's what I believed. A few weeks later Thanksgiving arrived. Margaret insisted on hosting despite every family member objecting. She ignored all objections. Naturally. Because Margaret Carter viewed other people's opinions as helpful suggestions. Nothing more. The dining room overflowed with relatives. Laughter bounced off the walls. Food covered every available surface. And somehow Emily ended up sitting beside me. Not across the table. Not somewhere else. Beside me. Margaret's doing. Obviously. I should probably explain something about my grandmother. She had many hobbies. Gardening. Crossword puzzles. Winning arguments. And attempting to orchestrate my love life. That last one was by far her favorite. Halfway through dinner she looked directly at Emily. Then directly at me. Then smiled. I immediately became suspicious. Which was usually the correct response whenever Margaret smiled like that. You know, she said casually, you two would save a lot of time if you'd stop pretending. Emily nearly choked on her water. I groaned. Grandma. What? We're not having this conversation. We never have this conversation. Exactly. That's the problem. Several relatives laughed. Emily stared very intensely at her mashed potatoes. I noticed. Briefly. Then forgot about it. Because I was an idiot. Not intentionally. Just consistently. Months passed. Life continued. Projects came and went. Seasons changed. And somehow Emily remained part of almost every chapter. Saturday farmers markets. Hospital visits with Margaret. Community events. Family dinners. Coffee runs. Hardware store trips. The strange thing was that none of it ever felt planned. It just happened. Naturally. Like gravity. Like routine. Like breathing. One Saturday morning we were walking through a local market when we stopped at a produce stand. Emily was negotiating over tomatoes. Again. She treated every purchase like international diplomacy. The vendor looked exhausted. I was entertained. Eventually she won. By 50 cents. Exactly 50 cents. She looked ridiculously proud of herself. Then handed me 3 bags to carry. Why am I holding everything? Because you're taller. That's not a reason. It's absolutely a reason. The vendor laughed. Emily laughed. I laughed. And for a moment it felt like every other Saturday we'd spent together. Then a voice interrupted us. An older woman arranging flowers nearby smiled warmly. Her eyes moved from me to Emily. Then back again. A familiar smile appeared. The kind we'd both seen before. So, she asked, when's the wedding? I laughed immediately. It happened all the time. Emily laughed too. At first. Then something changed. Very slightly. So slightly most people would have missed it. Her smile lingered. But her eyes didn't. For a split second she looked away. Toward the ground. Toward nowhere. As if the question carried more weight than it should have. Then she smiled again. The moment disappeared. I noticed it. And dismissed it. Just like I dismissed everything else. Because that's what I always did. But later that night, something happened. Something small. Something insignificant. Something I couldn't stop thinking about. I was at Emily's apartment dropping off paperwork Margaret needed. Emily was in the kitchen making tea. I wandered into the living room while waiting. That's when I saw it. A framed photograph sitting on a bookshelf. An old picture. Taken years earlier at a summer barbecue. I remembered the day instantly. Margaret was there. Half the family was there. Dozens of people were there. But that wasn't what caught my attention. What caught my attention was the photo itself. Because out of everyone who had attended that barbecue, the picture wasn't of Margaret. It wasn't of the family. It wasn't of the group. It wasn't even of Emily. It was of me. Just me. Standing beside a grill. laughing at something someone had said. I stared at it. Longer than I should have. Then I heard Emily approaching from the kitchen. And for the first time since the hospital, a strange thought crossed my mind. What if she actually meant it? For the rest of that evening, I couldn't stop looking at the photograph. Not because there was anything unusual about it. At least not on the surface. It was just an old picture. A random summer afternoon from years earlier. One moment out of thousands. And yet, the longer I stared at it, the stranger it felt. Because people don't usually frame photographs of someone else's grandson. At least I didn't think they did. I heard Emily setting 2 mugs on the kitchen counter. A moment later she walked into the living room. Her eyes immediately followed mine. Straight to the picture. For the briefest second, something flickered across her face. Surprise. Then nervousness. Then a smile. Gone almost instantly. Oh. She walked over casually. Or at least she tried to appear casual. That old thing. I looked at her. You kept this? Her smile widened. Barely. The frame looked brand new. I glanced back at the photograph. You know that's kind of weird, right? She laughed. Not loudly. Not naturally. Just enough. You're in a lot of family pictures. This one isn't a family picture. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she picked up her tea. Took a sip. Looked out the window. And somehow changed the subject without actually changing the subject. Margaret says you're working too much again. I should have pushed further. I didn't. Because at the time I still believed there had to be some perfectly reasonable explanation. There always was. Wasn't there? The problem started the next morning. Because once you notice something, you can't unnotice it. And suddenly I was noticing everything. Things that had been happening for years. Things I had somehow never questioned before. The first clue arrived 3 days later. It was raining. Which, in Portland, narrows the date down to roughly 300 days a year. I was finishing paperwork in my office when Emily texted me. Happy anniversary. I stared at the message. Then frowned. Anniversary? Of what? Before I could respond, another message appeared. 5 years ago today. Your company completed its first project. I leaned back in my chair. Surprised. Because she was right. 5 years earlier, I'd finished my first independent renovation job. A tiny bathroom remodel. Nothing special. I barely remembered the date myself. Yet somehow Emily did. I texted back. You remembered that? A few seconds later. Of course. You talked about it for weeks. I smiled. Then paused. Because the truth was, I hadn't talked about it for weeks. I'd mentioned it once. Maybe twice. 5 years ago. Yet she remembered. The realization stayed with me longer than it should have. And unfortunately, it wasn't the last one. A week later, I stopped by Margaret's house after work. Emily was helping organize a storage closet. The kind of task my grandmother created whenever she got bored. I walked into the living room and found several open boxes spread across the floor. Old books. Photo albums. Holiday decorations. Years of accumulated memories. Emily sat cross-legged on the rug sorting through everything. Need help? She looked up. You volunteering? No. Smart man. I laughed and sat down anyway. A few minutes later she pulled something from a box. A small ceramic bird. Blue. Hand-painted. The sight of it immediately felt familiar. Where'd you get that? Emily looked at the bird. Then at me. You gave it to me. I frowned. I did. 3 Christmases ago. I don't remember that. Her smile softened. I know. She placed the bird carefully beside her. Like something fragile. Something valuable. I stared at it. Trying to remember. Slowly, the memory surfaced. Christmas party. Gift exchange. Last-minute purchase. Nothing important. At least not to me. Yet somehow she'd kept it for years. Not in storage. Not hidden away. Protected. Displayed. Preserved. And suddenly I found myself wondering how many other things she'd saved. How many little moments I had forgotten. How many details I'd overlooked. The questions kept growing. And the answers became harder to ignore. The third clue arrived completely by accident. A few days later we were driving Margaret to a doctor's appointment. Traffic crawled along the highway. Margaret had fallen asleep in the backseat. For once, the car was quiet. Emily sat beside me, watching the rain streak across the passenger window. Then she suddenly said, "You still carry that picture in your wallet?" I glanced at her. "What picture?" "The one of your parents." My hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. I hadn't spoken about that picture in years. Very few people even knew it existed. "How do you know about that?" Emily immediately looked uncomfortable. Like she'd said something she shouldn't have. "You showed me once." "I did." "You were helping Margaret move furniture." Her voice softened. "It fell out when you opened your wallet." I searched my memory. And eventually found it. A random afternoon. Years ago. A conversation that lasted maybe 30 seconds. One tiny moment. One detail. One thing I'd completely forgotten. Emily hadn't. She remembered all of it. The exact picture. The exact day. The exact story I'd told. Something about that realization settled heavily in my chest. Because this wasn't normal anymore. This wasn't someone remembering a coffee order. This wasn't someone being polite. This was something else. Something deeper. Something I wasn't ready to name. And unfortunately, Margaret seemed determined to force me toward that conclusion. She started interfering more openly after that. Not subtly. Not carefully. Openly. If Emily and I arrived at the same time, Margaret suddenly needed help carrying groceries. Together. If we visited on weekends, she found reasons to disappear into other rooms. If Emily made lunch, Margaret insisted I stay. If I planned to leave early, Margaret suddenly developed questions that required both of us. At first I thought I was imagining it. Then one afternoon I caught her smiling. Watching us. Like someone observing a television show she'd already seen before. That should have worried me. Instead, I asked, "Why are you looking at us like that?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "I'm waiting." "For what?" She smiled. "For one of you to catch up." Emily nearly dropped her coffee. I rolled my eyes. And Margaret looked genuinely disappointed. Weeks passed. The tension grew. Not because anything happened. Because nothing happened. That's what made it worse. The more I noticed, the more impossible it became to stop noticing. The way Emily looked at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. The way she smiled when I walked into a room. The way she always seemed happiest when we were together. And for the first time in years, I started looking back. Really looking. Not at Emily the caregiver. Not at Emily the family friend. Not at Emily the woman who had simply always been there. I started seeing Emily as a woman. And that realization terrified me. Because once that door opened, I couldn't close it again. The turning point came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Margaret sat on her porch wrapped in a blanket. The sky was gray. Rain threatened in the distance. Emily had gone inside to answer a phone call. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Margaret broke the silence. "Some people spend years looking for love." I laughed. "Here we go." She didn't laugh. Instead, she stared toward the backyard. Watching the trees sway. Watching the wind move through the branches. Then she quietly added, "While it's standing in the room with them." The smile faded from my face. Something about her tone felt different. Serious. Certain. Almost sad. For the first time, I wondered something I hadn't wanted to ask myself. Had I been blind? The thought lingered for days. And then, just when I thought things couldn't become more confusing, Margaret made everything worse. It happened 3 nights later. I was helping her organize old paperwork at the dining room table. Emily had already gone home. The house felt unusually quiet. Margaret shuffled through a stack of folders. Then casually asked, "Do you know why Emily turned down Chicago?" I froze. My head snapped up. "What?" Margaret didn't look surprised. In fact, She looked disappointed. Like she'd expected that reaction. You didn't know? My stomach tightened. Know what? She slowly set down the folder. And suddenly the room felt much smaller. Much quieter. Much heavier. Margaret looked directly at me. Then spoke so softly I almost missed it. She stayed because of you. She stayed because of you. For a moment, I genuinely thought I'd misheard her. The grandfather clock in Margaret's dining room continued ticking softly somewhere behind me. Rain tapped against the windows. The refrigerator hummed quietly in the kitchen. Everything felt normal. Except it wasn't. Because one sentence had suddenly made the room feel completely different. I stared at my grandmother. Waiting. Hoping she'd smile. Hoping she'd tell me she was exaggerating. Margaret did neither. Instead, she calmly folded another document and slid it into a folder. Like she hadn't just turned my entire understanding of the last 3 years upside down. What do you mean she stayed because of me? Margaret looked up. The expression on her face reminded me of someone watching a man struggle to solve a puzzle after everyone else already knew the answer. Oh, Daniel. I hated when she started sentences that way. What? She sighed. Sometimes I wonder how you manage to run a successful business. I frowned. What does that mean? It means you're brilliant when it comes to houses. I already knew where this was going. And completely hopeless when it comes to people. I opened my mouth to argue. Then stopped. Because for the first time, I wasn't entirely sure she was wrong. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Mostly because I didn't know what else to say. And because Margaret clearly wasn't interested in explaining further. She dropped the clue. Now she expected me to figure it out myself. Unfortunately, once that possibility entered my mind, it refused to leave. The drive home felt longer than usual. The windshield wipers moved back and forth rhythmically. Streetlights blurred through the rain. And all I could think about was Emily. The photograph. The coffee. The birthdays. The way she'd looked at me in the hospital room. The way she'd looked away whenever someone mentioned relationships. The way she'd whispered, "Maybe I could be." The memory replayed over and over. Each time sounding a little less imaginary. A little more real. A little more dangerous. Because if Margaret was telling the truth, then I'd missed something enormous. Something that had been standing directly in front of me. And suddenly I needed answers. The problem was that Emily didn't seem interested in giving me any. 3 days later, another storm rolled through Portland. Heavy rain. Strong winds. The kind of weather that turned entire afternoons gray. Margaret had insisted on sitting on her covered porch anyway. Naturally. Because being stubborn was one of her favorite hobbies. Eventually she went inside to answer a phone call. Leaving Emily and me alone. The rain fell steadily beyond the porch roof. Water streamed from the gutters. The air smelled like wet pine and fresh earth. For several moments neither of us spoke. Emily sat wrapped in a blanket. Watching the storm. I watched her. Trying not to. Failing completely. Finally I cleared my throat. Can I ask you something? Her eyes moved toward me. Immediately cautious. Depends. I smiled. That's not encouraging. It wasn't supposed to be. For a second we both laughed. The familiar ease returned. Then disappeared just as quickly. Because this wasn't a normal conversation anymore. Not for me. Margaret mentioned Chicago. The reaction was instant. Small. But instant. Emily's smile faded. Not completely. Just enough. Of course, most people wouldn't have noticed. 3 months earlier I wouldn't have noticed. Now I did. Oh. She looked back toward the rain. She told you. She did. Several seconds passed. Neither of us spoke. Finally I asked. Why didn't you go? Emily folded the blanket tighter around herself. The movement seemed almost defensive. I had reasons. What reasons? Her gaze remained fixed on the storm. Margaret needed help. The answer sounded prepared. Practiced. Like she'd given it before. Maybe to herself. Maybe to other people. Maybe both. But something felt incomplete. The way a story feels incomplete when someone skips the ending. I waited, certain there was more. Eventually Emily smiled. Softly. Sadly. Then stood. I should check on Margaret. And just like that, the conversation was over. Again. The second unanswered question in less than a week. Unfortunately, they didn't stop there. A few days later, Margaret had another routine appointment. Nothing serious. Just tests. The kind that seemed to occupy half of retirement. The drive home was quiet. Margaret slept in the back seat. Emily sat beside me. Sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time all day. Golden light spilled across the dashboard. Neither of us seemed eager to interrupt the silence. Eventually Emily spoke. You know something? I glanced toward her. What? A small smile touched her lips. You're a good man. The compliment caught me off guard. Mostly because it sounded different than usual. More personal somehow. I laughed awkwardly. I don't know about that. You are. Her voice softened. Certain. Without hesitation. Without doubt. And suddenly I found myself wanting to know why. Wanting to know what she saw when she looked at me. Wanting to ask 100 questions. But before I could say anything, Margaret stirred awake. Immediately complaining about hospital coffee. The moment vanished. Again. Everything kept vanishing. Every meaningful conversation. Every opportunity. Every answer. Like something was actively preventing us from saying what needed to be said. The strange part was what happened next. Because while I was moving closer, Emily seemed to be moving away. At first it was subtle. A delayed text message. A cancelled lunch. An early goodbye. Small things. Easy things to ignore. Until they weren't. Eventually I noticed a pattern. She wasn't busier. She wasn't upset. She wasn't angry. She was distancing herself. The realization bothered me more than it should have. Far more. Because somewhere along the way, something had changed. I started looking for her. Waiting for her calls. Looking forward to seeing her. Missing her when she wasn't around. And the more I noticed those feelings, the harder they became to dismiss. The worst part? I still wasn't completely sure what was happening. Only that I didn't like the idea of losing her. Not even a little. The final conversation happened nearly 2 weeks later. Close to midnight. Margaret had fallen asleep in her recliner. The house was quiet. Only the kitchen light remained on. I walked in to find Emily making tea. Steam rose from the kettle. Soft music played from a nearby speaker. The moment felt strangely intimate. Comfortable. Dangerously comfortable. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then I finally asked. Emily? She looked up. Yeah. Why did you stay? Everything stopped. The music. The kettle. Even the air seemed still. For one brief moment, I thought she might actually tell me. Really tell me. Her eyes met mine. And I saw something there. Something raw. Something vulnerable. Something that looked suspiciously like heartbreak. Then her phone rang. The sound shattered the moment instantly. Emily closed her eyes. Almost disappointed. Then answered. The conversation ended before it ever truly began. And afterward, nothing felt the same. Because now I knew there was a truth between us. A truth both of us could see. But neither of us seemed willing to touch. A week later, I arrived at Margaret's house unexpectedly. The front door was slightly open. Voices drifted from the living room. Emily's voice. And another woman's. I wasn't trying to listen. At least not at first. Then I heard something that stopped me in my tracks. The position is still available. Silence. Then another voice. You should take it. My stomach tightened. I moved closer. Without meaning to. Without thinking. The conversation continued. And then Emily spoke. Her voice sounded tired. Not physically tired. Emotionally tired. The kind of tired that comes from waiting too long for something that never arrives. A soft laugh escaped her. Sad. Resigned. Then she said the words that made my chest tighten. Maybe it's finally time for me to move on. And for the first time, I realized I might actually lose her. I realized I might actually lose her. The thought followed me home. It followed me to work. It followed me through every conversation, every meal, every quiet moment when my mind had nothing else to focus on. For years, Emily had simply existed in my life. Steady, constant, reliable, like sunrise, like gravity, like something that would always be there. I had never stopped to imagine what life would look like without her. Now I couldn't stop imagining it. And I hated every version. The next morning I arrived at Margaret's house earlier than usual. Partly because I wanted to check on her. Mostly because I hoped Emily would be there. The driveway was empty. Her car was gone. For some reason that bothered me more than it should have. Margaret noticed immediately. Of course she did. My grandmother had spent 82 years mastering the art of noticing things people wanted hidden. She looked up from her crossword puzzle. "You're looking for Emily." I frowned. "No, I'm not." Margaret smiled. The kind of smile that meant she was about to win an argument. "Daniel." "What?" "You've been looking for her for 3 weeks." I opened my mouth, closed it, then sat down heavily across from her. Because denying it suddenly felt pointless. Margaret folded her hands. Patiently. Waiting. Eventually I asked the question that had been consuming me. Did she really turn down Chicago? Margaret nodded. Yes. Why? She studied me carefully, as if deciding how much truth I could handle. Then she answered. Because I needed help. I exhaled slowly. Finally. A reasonable explanation. A logical explanation. An explanation that made sense. Emily was compassionate. Loyal. The type of person who sacrificed opportunities for people she cared about. Of course she would stay for Margaret. The answer fit perfectly. At least for a moment. Then something about Margaret's expression bothered me. Because she wasn't finished. I could tell. The same way I could tell when a wall looked straight but wasn't. Something remained hidden beneath the surface. What? Margaret tilted her head. What? You're holding something back. A faint smile appeared. Maybe. Grandma. She laughed softly. Then looked toward the living room window. Watching rain slide down the glass. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded unusually gentle. That explanation stopped being true years ago. The room went completely still. I stared at her, certain I had misunderstood. What? Margaret slowly looked back at me. And for the first time in weeks, there was no teasing in her eyes. No mischief. No games. Only certainty. At first she stayed because of me. My stomach tightened. Then Margaret delivered the sentence that changed everything. After that, she stayed because of you. I couldn't speak. Couldn't move. Couldn't think. The words simply hung there. Heavy. Permanent. Impossible to ignore. For several seconds all I heard was the rain. The ticking clock. My own heartbeat. Because suddenly every clue I'd ignored came rushing back. The photograph. The coffee. The birthdays. The Christmas gifts. The hospital whisper. The way she'd looked at me. The way she'd looked away. The way she'd waited. And waited. And waited. A strange ache settled in my chest. Not because I didn't believe Margaret. Because I did. For the first time, I truly did. And that realization came with something else. Something worse. Guilt. A crushing kind of guilt. Because if she was right, then Emily had spent years loving someone who never noticed. Years standing beside me. Years hoping. Years staying. And somehow I had missed all of it. I rubbed my hands over my face. Trying to process everything. Trying to understand how I could have been so blind. Margaret watched quietly. Then stood. Without another word, she disappeared down the hallway. I assumed the conversation was over. Several minutes passed. Then she returned carrying a small wooden box. Dark walnut. Worn edges. The kind of box that looked important before you even opened it. She placed it carefully on the table. I looked at it. Then at her. What's this? Margaret sat down again. Her expression softened. Something Emily never wanted anyone to see. Every instinct told me not to open it. I opened it anyway. Inside were dozens of folded papers. Neatly organized. Carefully preserved. Some were letters. Some were journal pages. Some were greeting cards. Others looked like notes written quickly in moments of emotion. I picked up the first one. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. My name wasn't written on the front. But somehow I knew. The moment I unfolded it, I knew. The first letter wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even meant to be sent. It was simply Emily writing about a family barbecue years earlier. About how happy she'd felt spending the day with everyone. About how much she'd enjoyed talking to me. One line caught my attention immediately. Daniel always makes everyone feel comfortable. Even when he doesn't realize he's doing it. I swallowed hard. Then reached for another. And another. And another. Hours seemed to disappear. Each letter revealing another piece of a story I never knew existed. A story happening right beside me. A story I should have seen. One birthday note described a gift she'd spent weeks choosing. Only to decide against giving it to me because she worried I'd think too much of it. One Christmas entry talked about watching me laugh with my family across the room. And wondering what it would feel like if she ever truly belonged there. One journal page described the day I fixed her kitchen sink. The very day I barely remembered. The page ended with a sentence that made my chest tighten. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness become the hardest things to forget. The deeper I read, the harder it became to continue. Because every page carried the same emotion. Hope. Then patience. Then disappointment. Then hope again. Year after year. Emily never sounded angry. Never bitter. Never entitled. Only patient. Painfully patient. The kind of patience that breaks your heart because you know exactly how much it costs. By evening, the rain outside had stopped. The house had grown quiet. Margaret had fallen asleep in her chair. Still, I kept reading. Page after page. Memory after memory. Until eventually I reached the final letter. The newest one. The one folded separately from the rest. My hands shook slightly as I opened it. The handwriting looked familiar now. Every curve. Every line. Every carefully chosen word. I read slowly. Not wanting it to end. Not wanting to discover what came next. Then I reached the final paragraph. And everything inside me seemed to stop. Because written there, in neat blue ink, were the words I would never forget. If he ever sees me the way I see him, I'd stay forever. I stared at the sentence. Once. Twice. 10 times. The words never changed. Neither did the meaning. For years, Emily had loved me. For years, she'd waited. For years, she'd stayed. And now, I finally understood why. But the next discovery hit even harder. Because tucked beneath the letter was something else. A printed email. Recently dated. My eyes moved across the page. And the moment I reached the subject line, my stomach dropped. Employment offer, accepted. Below it was a start date. A location. And a confirmation. Emily had accepted another position. Out of state. I checked the date again. Certain I was reading it wrong. I wasn't. The start date was 3 days away. 3 days. After years of waiting. After years of staying. Emily was finally leaving. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure I could let her go. 3 days. That was all I had. After years of not seeing what was right in front of me, life had suddenly handed me a deadline. Not a vague one. Not an emotional one. A real one. 72 hours before Emily Brooks left Portland. 72 hours before the woman who had quietly loved me for years packed up her life and walked out of mine. And the worst part was, I couldn't blame her. Not even a little. That first day, I did what I always did when life became too complicated. I worked. I showed up at a job site before sunrise. Measured boards. Checked framing. Marked lines with a pencil. Told myself that if I kept my hands busy, my mind would follow. It didn't. Every nail I drove sounded like a countdown. Every cut of the saw felt like time disappearing. 3 days. Then 2. Then 1. By noon, I'd ruined 2 pieces of lumber and measured the same opening 4 different ways. My apprentice finally looked at me and said, "Boss, maybe you should go home." I almost laughed. Because home was exactly the problem. Every version of home I imagined from that moment forward had Emily missing from it. No coffee waiting in my truck. No quiet smile across Margaret's kitchen. No teasing voice telling me I was overthinking something. No familiar presence that made every room feel warmer without trying. And somehow that absence felt louder than anything she'd ever said. That evening, I went to Margaret's house. She was sitting in her favorite chair near the window, wrapped in a blanket, looking smaller than usual. For once, she didn't tease me when I walked in. She didn't smile. She simply looked at me and said, "You read the letter." I nodded. My throat felt tight. "And the email?" I nodded again. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. As if even she had hoped Emily would wait longer. Then she opened them. "Are you going to do anything?" I looked away. "I don't know what to say." "That's never stopped you before." "This is different." "Yes," she said softly. "It is." I sat across from her, elbows on my knees, hands clasped so tightly my knuckles hurt. "What if I'm too late?" Margaret watched me carefully. Then leaned forward just a little. "Love isn't something you find after you're certain, Daniel." I looked up. Her voice was weaker than usual. But her words weren't. "It's something you choose before you are." The room went quiet. That sentence stayed with me. Long after I left her house. Long after I drove through the dark streets with no destination. Long after I found myself parked outside Emily's apartment building, staring up at her window like a man trying to decide whether courage was something he still had. Her light was on. Then it went out. And I did nothing. That was the first day. The second day was worse. Emily came to Margaret's house to help sort medication schedules before leaving. Before leaving. Those words made my chest ache every time I thought them. She moved through the house calmly. Efficiently. Making lists. Labeling folders. Writing instructions for the temporary caregiver. She looked composed. Prepared. Almost peaceful. But I knew better now. I had read the letters. I knew how much emotion she could hide behind a calm face. When we ended up alone in the kitchen, I almost spoke. She was standing at the counter, sealing an envelope with Margaret's appointment details inside. Sunlight touched the side of her face. For a second, I saw every version of her at once. The caregiver. The friend. The woman at the hospital window. The woman who had whispered 4 words I wasn't ready to hear. The woman who had waited until waiting hurt too much. Emily. She looked up. Yeah. That was it. 1 word. 1 opening. 1 chance. And I froze. Because suddenly every possible confession felt too small. Too late. Too unfair. She studied me for a moment. Then gave me the smallest smile. Not hopeful. Not expectant. Just tired. I should finish packing. And then she walked away. I let her. Again. That night, I barely slept. Fear has a way of making hours stretch. Regret makes them worse. I replayed everything. Every missed clue. Every interrupted conversation. Every time she had looked at me like she was waiting for me to understand. And I hadn't. By morning, the final day had arrived. Emily's flight was scheduled for 6:30. Margaret called me at 8. Not to comfort me. Not to encourage me. To yell. "Daniel Carter, if you let that woman leave without telling her the truth, I will haunt you." "Grandma. I am not joking." "I know." "Good. Then stop acting like a coward." The line went silent. For a moment, all I heard was her breathing. Then her voice softened. "She doesn't need perfect words." My hand tightened around the phone. "Then what does she need?" "The truth." By late afternoon, rain had begun falling again. Of course it had. Portland had always loved dramatic timing. I drove to the airport with my heart pounding so hard it felt impossible that the rest of the world couldn't hear it. Cars moved too slowly. Traffic lights lasted too long. Every minute felt stolen. When I finally reached the terminal, I ran. Past families. Past rolling suitcases. Past people beginning journeys and ending them. For one terrible moment, I couldn't find her. Then I saw her. Emily. Standing near security. One suitcase beside her. Boarding pass in her hand. She looked smaller somehow. Not weak. Just alone. I slowed as I approached. She turned before I said her name. As if some part of her had been expecting me. Or hoping not to. Daniel. I stopped a few feet away. Breathless. Terrified. Completely unprepared. Which, strangely enough, was probably the most honest I'd ever been. I read them. Her face changed instantly. The color left her cheeks. What? The letters. Her eyes filled with something between hurt and fear. You weren't supposed to see those. I know. Then why? Because I needed to understand what I was too blind to see. She looked away. Tears gathering now. I stepped closer. Not enough to crowd her. Just enough that she could hear me over the noise of the terminal. I don't deserve the years you gave me. Her lips trembled. Daniel. I don't. I know that. My voice cracked. And for once, I didn't care. I spent years fixing broken things in other people's homes while missing the one thing in my own life that mattered most. A tear slipped down her cheek. I continued before fear could stop me. I was blind, Emily. Completely blind. But I'm not blind anymore. She looked at me then. Really looked at me. And everything I had been afraid to say rose to the surface. I love you. The words came out simple. Plain. True. No performance. No perfect speech. Just truth. I love you, and I don't want you to leave. Not because I'm afraid to be alone. Not because Margaret pushed me. Not because I read those letters. I swallowed. Because when I imagine tomorrow without you in it, nothing feels like home anymore. Emily covered her mouth with one hand. Crying quietly now. For a second, I thought she might step toward me. Instead, she looked down. At the boarding pass in her hand. The final call echoed somewhere above us. Her flight. Her future. Her escape. She stared at the paper. Then slowly looked back at me. She slowly looked back at me. For a moment, neither of us moved. The airport seemed to disappear. The announcements. The rolling suitcases. The conversations. The crowds rushing past us. All of it faded into the background. There was only Emily. Only the tears in her eyes. Only the boarding pass still trembling slightly in her hand. And the terrifying uncertainty of what she would do next. I had finally said everything. There were no more letters to read. No more clues to uncover. No more misunderstandings to hide behind. The truth stood between us now. Complete. Exposed. And for the first time in years, neither of us could pretend not to see it. Emily lowered her gaze. Looking at the boarding pass again. The piece of paper she'd spent weeks planning around. The escape route she'd finally convinced herself to take. The future she'd built after giving up on the one she'd hoped for. A future that didn't include me. I watched her fingers tighten around the edge of it. Then loosen again. Tighten. Then loosen. As if she were having an argument with herself. Part of me wanted to speak. To say more. To convince her. To fight for her. But Margaret's words echoed inside my head. She doesn't need perfect words. She needs the truth. And I had already given her that. Now the decision belonged to her. Emily laughed softly through her tears. The sound broke my heart. Because it wasn't sadness. It wasn't happiness. It was relief. The kind of relief people feel when they finally stop carrying something alone. You really are blind sometimes. I blinked. Then, despite everything, I laughed. A shaky laugh. A nervous laugh. The kind that comes after surviving something terrifying. That's fair. Daniel. Her voice cracked. She looked away briefly before finding the courage to meet my eyes again. I waited so long. The words hit harder than anything else she'd said. Not because I didn't know. Because now I did. I knew exactly how long. The letters had shown me. The birthdays. The Christmases. The missed opportunities. The hopes she'd carefully buried whenever they became too painful. And the realization hurt. Not because she had loved me. Because she'd done it alone. I'm sorry. The apology escaped before I could stop it. Emily immediately shook her head. No. A tear slipped down her cheek. No more apologizing. But You didn't know. Her voice softened. And I never told you. For a second neither of us spoke. Then Emily smiled. A real smile this time. Small. Warm. Familiar. The smile I'd seen 1,000 times before. Only now I understood it. Finally. Completely. And somehow that made it feel brand new. The final boarding call echoed overhead. One last reminder. One last decision. One last chance. Emily looked down at the boarding pass again. Then slowly exhaled. Years of uncertainty seemed to leave her body all at once. Without another word, she folded the paper in half. Then folded it again. And again. Until it became nothing more than a small rectangle in her hand. I watched silently. Afraid to hope. Afraid to breathe. Then she smiled. And tore it in half. For a second I simply stared. Unable to process what I'd seen. The torn pieces slipped from her fingers into the nearby trash bin. Gone. Just like that. The flight. The move. The escape plan. Gone. A fresh wave of tears filled her eyes. Only this time they looked different. Lighter somehow. As if she had finally put down something she'd been carrying for years. You have any idea how hard you made this? I laughed. Unfortunately, yes. Good. She stepped forward. Closing the distance between us. Not dramatically. Not like something from a movie. Just naturally. Like two people who had spent years standing beside each other and had finally stopped standing apart. Then she wrapped her arms around me. And for the first time in my life, coming home felt like a person. The months that followed weren't perfect. Real life never is. Margaret continued interfering in our business whenever possible. Mostly because she enjoyed reminding everyone she had been right. Repeatedly. And loudly. According to her, she'd solved the entire problem years earlier. We were simply too stubborn to cooperate. Honestly, she wasn't entirely wrong. 6 months later, we gathered for a family dinner at Margaret's house. The same dining room. The same table. The same familiar laughter filling every corner of the room. Only this time something had changed. Something everyone noticed. No one needed to ask questions anymore. No one made jokes about weddings. No one wondered what Emily and I were to each other. Because for the first time, the answer was obvious. Emily sat beside me. Her hand resting comfortably in mine beneath the table. No pretending. No uncertainty. No missed signals. Across the room, Margaret watched us with the satisfaction of a woman who had waited years for a prediction to come true. Eventually she caught me looking. And smiled. That same knowing smile. The one she'd worn from the very beginning. The one that now made perfect sense. Looking back, my grandmother wasn't trying to find me a wife. She wasn't trying to create a love story. She wasn't trying to control my future. She was simply trying to show me something everyone else could already see. The woman I needed wasn't waiting somewhere out in the world. She wasn't a stranger. She wasn't a future possibility. She was the woman who had quietly stood beside me through every season of my life. Patiently. Faithfully. Lovingly. And when Emily whispered those 4 words in that hospital room, she wasn't making a joke. She wasn't speaking carelessly. She was telling the truth. The truth she'd been carrying for years. The truth I wasn't ready to hear. Until I almost lost it. And sometimes, I think that's the strangest thing about love. The right person can stand beside you for years. And you won't truly see them until the moment you're afraid they'll walk away. Thankfully for me, Emily stayed.